last time I checked, shit's still expensive. And my paycheck, our paychecks, are simply not keeping up. Do I overspend on coffee and clothes? How about eating out? But there is something happening to our incomes and the Canadian economy that can't just be blamed on my questionable financial decision-making. We're as broke as the Europeans, but we don't get 18 weeks of vacation in the south of France. We're as whipped as corporate America without the Silicon Valley salaries. Not even a post-lunch siesta to survive the grind. I know you're worried. Don't. It's okay. Our banker turned Prime Minister Mark Carney, he knows the economy. He breathes the economy. For God's sake, he's a doctor of economics. And he has diagnosed our problem.
The reality of the impact of our long-standing weak productivity is making life less affordable for Canadians and is beginning to strain our government finances.
What even is productivity? It's basically what you produce for the resources you're given or that you use. Take our show, for example. Our input is hours researching, writing, recording, editing, the cost of gear, the cost of this studio, and our team's time. The output is this show that you're watching, one episode per week. If our tyrannical dictator, Jesse Brown, told us minions to boost productivity, first, we'd revolt. No! Then we'd make it work by streamlining our research process, upgrading our tools, begrudgingly using AI, and somehow we'd crank out 2 episodes a week. On the national scale, it's the same idea. And apparently, this economy is just not productive enough. This episode, I'm talking to Philip Cross. He's a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute who spent 36 years at Statistics Canada. He was appointed chief economic analyst in 2008. For some reason, I feel like that may have been an important year for economists. Can't really put my finger on it. I'm also talking to Brian Lewis. He's a professor at U of T's Monk School. He was the chief economist in Ontario's Ministry of Finance, and most importantly, he's also in a band with other economists called Invisible Hands. Get it? I didn't at first, but apparently it's an economics joke. I want to know, is the productivity crisis why we all can't afford nice things, or are we just lazy? Let's get into it. I'm going to be honest, Philip. I don't know if I really give a damn about productivity. Like, when I hear the word productivity, I kind of want to throw open my mouth a little bit. What do you mean? You want me to work more than I already do? I don't own this business, I just work here. What is productivity?
Well, and I don't blame you. I mean, when I worked at Statistics Canada, I used to tell people in GDP division, you're lucky GDP is related to employment or nobody would care. It's a concept hard to understand and hard to bring down to people's everyday lives.
I sometimes probably wanted to throw up in my mouth talking about GDP as well. So
and that's, the basis of the argument is that productivity and incomes are closely related. I think everybody would agree that incomes are not growing in this country in recent years the way they did historically. The solution to that is higher productivity. So you may not understand productivity, but you're living with the consequences of it.
But when we talk about productivity, are we talking about on the individual level? Like you, individual worker, work harder and smarter and more efficiently?
I think productivity does mean different things to different people. How much output are we getting per unit of labor input? But you can think about it at a sectoral level. You can think about it at a provincial level. You can think about it even at an individual level. There are ways to think about it positively, right? Like, for example, rather than thinking about I'm just going to work more so my boss makes more money, you can think about it as could I work less and make more? Could I work a little bit less and make the same, right? Like that's another way to think about it. Or I could work the same and get more for it. We can get more stuff made in the economy, more goods and services using the same or even less labor. That's a good thing for us.
So productivity, according to Philip, a dictator of wages, and according to you, Brian, it's not just like always throw up in your mouth kind of thing. We don't need to be so pessimistic about it, I guess. Look, the reason I want to have this conversation is because I feel like for over a year, I've been hearing about this productivity crisis. Mark Carney kind of ran on it. He talked about it in his throne speech. He talked about it in his mandate letter. Is there a productivity crisis, yes or no, Philip?
Oh, there's no question there is. I think there's quite an extraordinary intervention by the Bank of Canada. Caroline Wilkins, the deputy governor, put this issue on the table about a year ago. She said that not only is it a crisis, it is a, quote, break the glass crisis.
You know those signs that say, in an emergency, break the glass? Well, it's time to break the glass.
That is extraordinary for the Bank of Canada to say that. Their normal mandate is inflation, and they usually don't stray far from issues related to monetary policy like inflation and interest rates. For them to devote a whole speech to Canada's productivity problem, to describe it as a crisis, and then to pinpoint that the origin of this crisis is our chronically weak business investment, shows that the Bank of Canada says this is not just a minor problem. This has become a structural, decade-long problem. And we as a country are not going to be able to grow rapidly without inflation unless we boost our productivity. And that's why the Bank of Canada intervened, and she is summarizing what is, I think, a very strong consensus in the economics community that there's a productivity crisis. And I think it feeds down to the average person. The average person, they may not be aware that we have a productivity problem, but they're aware that our incomes are not growing the way they used to in this country.
So, Philip, you are a yes. There is a crisis, a break the glass crisis. Brian, do you believe there is a productivity crisis?
No, I totally disagree. I think it's one of the most ridiculous things I've heard the central bank ever say. And I think it stands on weak economic grounds. I'll give you two other reasons why it concerned me. The first was from a global perspective. Central banks have enormous amounts of credibility, more than they deserve. And, I thought the stuff about productivity in Canada was interesting and sometimes a little silly. And then, but once our central bank started talking about this, it started to give Canada a really bad image globally. And I didn't get angry about it until I started reading in, the Financial Times of London or the Economist magazine about, people just running the Canadian economy down and, they're sort of supported by our own central bank. So I'm really disappointed that they, for whatever reasons they chose to kind of like make our country look bad.
The Bank of Canada done no such thing. We've looked bad to foreigners for a long time. It's been very difficult to attract foreign investment into this country. Investors, perhaps not the ordinary person on the street, but investors, the people who count, have been increasingly reluctant to put their money into this country for a whole wide range of reasons, but most of it comes down to it's very difficult to get around the regulations and make a profit in this country. So I disagree with that entirely, that the Bank of Canada is not the source of our international image problem. It's much broader than that, and it's been around for quite some time. And the opinion on the bank is unfair to the bank, not that I'm against being unfair to the bank. These are the people who lost control of inflation in 2021. So I'm quite capable of being critical of the bank, but not for that.
Brian, you think the bank made us look bad in front of our friends, in front of our peer countries. Philip, you're saying, well, we do look bad. We look very bad to our friends and our peer countries. Brian, bring me back to why you don't think we are having a productivity crisis, though.
We had 30 years of low, stable inflation in Canada, despite weakening productivity growth, right? We had a recent spike in inflation that had nothing to do with productivity. It had to do with global supply chains. So while there is a theoretical connection, and the Bank of Canada has a reason to be interested in productivity, it doesn't explain a lot of what's ever happened. And I think there's other things that have to be focused on, and that's really the gist of my concern about the productivity discussion. I think there's a lot of other things that affect our incomes than productivity, and I think we're focusing too much on the negative side of the story and too much on productivity. The part I would disagree with is about our ability to control productivity. A lot of the economics community would point out quite rightly that we've done a lot over time to try to enhance productivity from a public, and I mean really what the government can do. I mean, the government's got some levers here, but it's got limited levers. Lots of things were done out of, say, the McDonald Commission, which Philip and I might be the two of the three people on this are familiar with. That were productivity enhancing, globalizing trade, harmonizing, the value added tax and things like that. But if you track Canada's productivity growth, it actually started to go down when all these things happened. And it's not because they were bad economic policies. They were good economic policies for productivity growth. It's just other things were happening at the same time that made it hard for Canada to succeed. And I think we should focus on some of those other things as well. So I think using productivity as a lens for government policy is useful, actually. I don't mind it so much as like a going forward kind of lens. I just want it to be built off of some strengths. And then maybe that's the part we'll never really agree on.
So it's not necessarily that you don't think we should be a productive country. It's just that you don't think fixating on productivity is the way to go. And not just that, you think that we actually have very little control over productivity, and it may not be the only or most important determinant of our wages. Look, Philip, I know that you strongly believe they impact our wages, and I might not personally care about productivity, but I do care about how much money I make, how much money is in my bank account when I look at the damage after a long weekend. And what you and most economists argue is that if Canada increases its productivity, somehow I make more money. I like how that sounds, but how the hell does that work?
Well, it works by giving our firms the ability to compete, particularly in export markets, and it gives the incentive for firms to invest.
Brian, I would love for you to address this productivity equals higher wages, because that would make me really care about productivity if that was the case.
They're correlated. It's a reasonable thing to focus at. I just think that our productivity performance is a result of basically changing global trade, partly the consequence of changing global trading prices and investments in things that are low productivity but high income, partly. So, and the other thing I would point out is that, it's become, Philip again has some different calculations, but for much of the people who do serious research on this, there's been a persistent gap between productivity growth, labor productivity growth, and median wage growth in not just Canada, but a lot of economies.
Philip, what do you make of Brian's argument that there is a gap between productivity growth and the median wage growth?
I agree and disagree with Brian on that. Yes, I agree. There is this thing called the Drummond conundrum that we've adopted amongst economists. We've adopted many of the policies that economists have advocated over time, and our productivity has not increased. That's the conundrum. And so Brian's right in pointing out that we have done a lot of the things that economists have recommended, but I come to a different conclusion. I don't therefore say, well, productivity isn't important and let's not. I say that there's something else. There's another problem. And you look at the Canadian economy over the last 10 years when we've had this productivity crisis developing, what's been the number one feature of the Canadian economy over the last 10 years? It's been chronically weak business investment. And that's why I go back to, I think we need there a mixture of policies, but at this point, I think it might even be beyond policies. I think it might be a matter of culture. That, I alluded to earlier that foreign firms won't invest in Canada. Canadians increasingly won't invest in Canada. You look at Canadian firms, where are they expanding their operations? In the United States, overseas. Nobody wants to invest in this country. In this country, we're very good at attracting foreign workers, and especially young students. We have more of them as a share of our labor force, our population, than the U.S. does. The problem is, and their employment rates are just as high. So, they're integrating into our labor market. The problem is when they get into the labor market, they're earning almost half of what Americans, comparable foreign workers, earn in the American market. That's the problem. Is, we have a basic education and we have lots of startups of technology in this country. But once they get to a certain point, they either get bought out or they choose to move to the US. And, we don't have the next Nortel or Research in Motion or whatever that we used to have. And
We've got Shopify.
Shopify is one of the is about the last major technology firm that we have in this country. But compare Shopify to what's going on with what's called the Magnificent Seven in the US, NVIDIA, Microsoft, Apple, Google. I mean, these are world-class firms that dominate not just the technology sector in the US, they dominate it around the world. That's who we're competing against. And that's why I say it's going to take a cultural shift in this country that, we just can't continue to muddle along and have, ordinary good companies. We need extraordinary companies, and I don't think this country is incapable of doing it. We did it regularly in the 90s and 2000s. We had Nortels and Research in Motions, so we're capable of doing it. And I think it's a mixture of, on the one hand, of policies and regulations that discourage investment. We could have had, for example, a lot of investment in oil and gas and pipelines over the last 10 years that we explicitly discouraged.
Philip, you've said that, quote, Canada's productivity problem may now be too deeply ingrained in our culture. I don't know. It all sounds a little bit like a diss. Are you saying we're lazy? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, no, I debated this actually at the Rotmans Institute last spring with former governor of the Bank of Canada, Stephen Pollitt, the first thing he accused me of was saying Canadians are lazy, and that's not the case at all. Canadians, for example, I mean, a big problem with Canadian productivity is not Canadian workers don't work hard. In fact, that we work exceptionally long hours, but there's a broader problem, which is how we talk to the business sector in this country. And I think we don't talk about profit as being a good thing in this country. And we don't talk about profits leading to investment, leading to jobs. When we have a problem, for example, in our healthcare industry, we turn to government and we say, would you spend more? Would you throw more resources at it? We don't say, how could we get the private sector involved for innovative and new solutions in healthcare? Because our current system is not working. We just don't talk like that as a country. And that's why I think we have a broader cultural problem, not just a policy problem.
What do you make of the cultural argument that Philip made, Brian, that our productivity problem is somehow ingrained in our culture?
I'm not sure I agree. I don't know how we measure culture.
That sounds like the most economist thing I've ever heard. Like, I can't measure it.
Exactly. Well, I got to measure everything. I'm a numbers person at heart. I used to use Philip's numbers. Yeah. I don't know. I would say Canada doesn't adopt, like a live free kind of economy like the United States does or some other countries do, right? Like we do not embrace that the same way. And it does result in trade-offs. I think it means that we probably, would naturally have less robust economic growth, but we would also have more equally distributed income. So, I mean, and those are big trade-offs. But in the end, does it make Canada better or worse? Well, maybe there's a couple ways to look at it. Maybe first of all, you can vote with your feet, right? You can, if you like the sort of open, free, dynamic, high income, highly skewed income distribution in the United States, you can move there and hope you don't end up in El Salvador. If you want something more stable and more equal, maybe you can choose Canada. That's something that you can do. But the other thing I would point out is just who's happier in the end. Like in the end, that's what we're really talking about. Who's happier? And Canada's happiness, according to the World Happiness Report, I mean, Canada's numbers are going down, but we're still above the United States all the time. Like not a lot above, but basically, despite our weaker GDP per capita, Canadians tend to be a little bit happier on average than Americans.
Philip, you were rolling your eyes there for a second. Tell me, what are you thinking?
Well, I'm astonished that in the same paragraphs, on the one hand, Brian could say, well, dismisses culture because we can't measure it, and then invokes happiness, which is a completely subjective, hard to measure variable too. We can measure culture, actually. Edmund Phelps, who won a Nobel Prize for the study of economic growth, looked at the importance of various cultural attitudes to things like failure and independence. And he regressed this on economic growth across nations and found that there were significant differences, especially between Canada and the United States, that we're a much more risk adverse, less entrepreneurial, we don't allow our kids a lot of independence, for example. And these cultural attitudes were reflected in. So if you can come up with statistical measures of the impact of culture. So it's not just a matter of, I invoke culture and then I just wave my hands and say, well, nothing about it can be measured and therefore it can be easily dismissed.
Fair. Philip, you made this comparison to the United States earlier, so let's stay on that train of thought. The United States has one of the most productive economies in the world, but it also has extremely high levels of wealth and income inequality. The wealth gap in the United States is actually getting worse every single year. So based on what we know about the U.S., how do you convince me, or how do you convince anyone, that increasing productivity helps anyone's wages but the top earners? Like, how does increasing productivity help anyone's wages but the top earners?
The real problem in Canada is not the distribution of income. It's that we're not generating enough income in the first place. If you don't generate enough income, you can slice and dice it any way you want, and it's not going to be enough for the average person to materially impact the average person out there, particularly when the price of housing, blows through the roof in our major cities.
What do you make of that, Brian? That we should increase the pie before slicing it?
I think a lot of the economists who gravitate towards the productivity crisis argument would say that what you want to do is grow the pie and then figure out how to divide it up, rather than worry about dividing up a smaller or shrinking pie. And those are tough questions for governments, because when you're going out to the voters, and I think, Noor, you're doing a really good job of portraying that perspective, is people actually really lead off thinking about equality more, especially some groups of people. Some really good research out of Harvard University recently, before they got in trouble with the now American president, about how much people actually really focus on distribution and equality more than the idea of just them making more themselves. The previous Liberal prime minister focused way too much on equity and not enough on economic growth. Some of the policies you do to redistribute income might affect the incentives for people to invest or people to work, and there can be trade-offs. There aren't always. There are probably some policy unicorns out there. That is a serious challenge for policymakers, because they do often focus on, how do I know I'm not doing well? I can see somebody over there who's doing better, so now I'm mad. And I think the other challenge is, governments probably find it easier to redistribute the pie than to grow it. You can put in a big system of tax and transfers like we have in Canada that does a massive job redistributing income. And at some sense is quite successful, right? Like, if you took a look at what people's incomes are from work versus what they are not, our income distribution would be far more skewed to high-income people without that massive system of taxes and transfers. So there's a big task for governments to design how this whole system works. But, Nor, another issue you mentioned, and it's one that's been happening over time, is, and I think people feel it, is the corporate sector has been getting a larger share of the pie over time. And I wish I had better answers for why. But, according to, some of the studies, like the one from CSLS I was referring to, it's been a phenomenon across not just Canada, but pretty much all advanced economies, including the United States, that, corporate earnings as a share of GDP are going up and the wage share is going down.
Actually, corporate profits make up 20% of Canada's GDP, nearly double their share between 1960 to 2000. So yeah, you're definitely hitting on something there.
I think there's a big challenge for policymakers here when they go to people and say, here's what we need to do. But here's what I recommend for policymakers. Talk to people in terms that they actually understand. Right? Meet them where they are. So rather than talk about productivity and sound, whatever the heck that is, that sounds bad for me. It sounds like I'm working more for less or something. Talk to them about jobs and incomes.
This is such an interesting conversation, but I think most people don't really give a shit about productivity because it has a bit of a PR crisis.
Well, you're right. And it's something that, I was aware, even when I was at Statistics Canada, I worked on the same floor as the people who produced the productivity estimates. And, they were aware, obviously they believed quite strongly that productivity was important, but they were aware that publicly, and this is over 10 years ago, I've been out of Statistics Canada for over a decade now, but they're aware that if you talk about productivity, the average person hears, oh, my boss wants me to work harder and he wants to take more home for himself. And it's just not, politically, it's just not a winner. We're fighting over table scraps. I go back to, we've got to stop worrying about distributional issues and we've got to worry about growth issues. And that's why I think you see the Bank of Canada and other economists so strongly pushing the productivity narrative. We have to get away from the distributional issues in our society and get back to output. And that is difficult because we as human beings, we've been programmed up to 200 years ago. There was no economic growth in our history. The way you became richer was you went to the next country, you beat his brains in, you stole his money, you went to the local lord and you captured some land. It was a winner. It was a winner takes all, but it was a fixed pie. And the only way to increase what you had was to take it from somebody else. And that's really in our genes. And that's in our folklore and the way we think about a lot of things. It's very difficult for us as a species to think about that, we can have more, everybody can have more tomorrow. It leads to a completely different mindset about how we work together. And we're in the early stages of that, and we're not good at it. And our reflex when we get into trouble, like after 2015 when oil prices crashed, is, I'll just get a bunch of rich people, I'll tax them, and we'll redistribute the money to everyone, and that'll fix everything. Well, we've done that for 10 years, and it's put us, we've driven into a wall with that philosophy. So I think that goes back to, that has not working. There's only one other a serious alternative to this, and that's raising productivity.
It's how we got out of the caves. It's how we moved from being an agrarian society. It was new technologies, investing in machinery equipment, harnessing energy, organizing our production methods better and in more sophisticated ways. All those things that got us from scraping in the dirt to get by to the very affluent society we live in now are all like parts of productivity, right? So I think there's a big historical case. And I think, when economists focus on this, the ones who I think are well-intentioned are looking at things like that, and they've got a really good argument.
Well-intentioned economists. What are you suggesting here, Brian? Are there ill-intentioned economists?
Yes.
Great.
Absolutely there are. So I think, so on one hand, I respect Philip's views. I think he's well-intentioned, and we agree on many things. We disagree on some, but I am not questioning his objective here of having Canadians, have a higher standard of living. We just might disagree about how we measure it and how we get there. And a lot of and a lot of people are like that, but not everybody is. So first of all, I'll give you kind of three types. First of all, there are some people who are pessimists, and the economics profession has more than its share. As Thomas Carlyle once called it, the dismal science. There's people with a negative cognitive bias. I think economists maybe Philip has a measure of this. If you do, Philip, please send it to me. I'd love to see if economists have more negative cognitive bias than your average folk. I just happen to believe that. But some people just kind of fall into the negativity. It's just a thing. But I think the two more important ones there are people who have policy views. They want things done because they're self-interested. So what they will do is they'll say, hey, Canada's got a productivity crisis. So you got to do this thing, Mr. Carney or Mr. Ford. Oh, and I know it just happens to be really, really good for me, but that's really about the economy. But some people will use this burning platform that's been lit on fire to try to get what they want, right? So it gets used by some people who mean well, but there's also used by some people who are just trying to use it to get policy that's very much in their direct self-interest, and governments have to deal with that. It's also used for partisan purposes, right? Like if you, it really is a powerful thing to have Canadians feel whether their economy is really broken or not. And I think that if you are in the business of trying to get into government, if you're in opposition, so, different political parties, depending on what province you're in or nationally, you're going to portray the economy negatively because you like the idea that it's broken because it's going to help people say, hey, these people in charge are bad. I want to give them a shot because the economy is in crisis.
I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't ask who.
There's probably some good cases going on, say, in the telecommunications sector and competition that would probably fit into self-interest versus national interest.
But there are some ill-intentioned people out there, particularly amongst economists, and we saw this during 2008, 2009, the financial crisis. I saw people smiling who wanted the system to be destroyed, who wanted people, millions of people around the world, to lose their jobs, lose their wealth, lose everything they had worked for, and they smiled. They laughed at it. They wanted to see the system destroyed. Those are, when you talk about ill-intentioned people, that's the first group that came to my mind. And they're out there, and a disproportionate number of them are in universities.
So how do we fix productivity? How do we fix this crisis? Give me one. If you could tell Mark Carney and his government one thing that he should put on his agenda to fix this, what would it be? Let's start with you, Brian.
I'd say focus on jobs and incomes. Look at where the economy is going, where the opportunities are going in the future. Look at how we're going, technology is going to play a much bigger role and what that means, and just follow where that's going. And that will make good economic sense. It would actually boost productivity if you wanted to speak in those terms. But I would focus on that because I think that is a clearer sense of where you're going rather than dressing it up in more abstract language like productivity. And I think people would appreciate it more. I think they would see, okay, I see what you're getting at. You're saying this is the way the world's changing and you're trying to get us ready for it. That would be my advice.
Philip?
My advice would be to try to address the shortfall of business investment in this country over the last 10 years. That nothing we do in productivity or to boost the economy is going to be sustainable if we continue to give our workers only about half the computers and the capital equipment and infrastructure that Americans have to work with. As long as we have that kind of deficit, we're not going to be able to compete with Americans, and we're not going to be able to raise our productivity. So address the chronic weakness of business investment in this country.
Well, it was lovely having you both. Thank you so much for making the time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. Good to see you again, Philip. And anytime, it was good questions. And we really appreciated the time you put into this. Can't wait to see what comes out of it.
There's always so much politics news that you need to know. It's been a while. So Sam, our producer and Ottawa correspondent, is here to bring you up to speed. Sam, it's been a while. Missed you.
Life's been moving pretty slow this summer. You were on vacation. Aviva was on vacation. I was stuck. Noor. All alone. I had no one to talk to about what's happening on the Hill.
Well, update me. What's going on?
So the big news from last week is that Jenny Byrne, everyone's favorite ex-girlfriend of Pierre Poilievre, has stepped down from her role as top advisor in the Poilievre campaign.
Oof. This feels to me like when Camila Cabello left Fifth Harmony. Like, I saw it coming, the build-up, the tension, but I actually can't believe it happened.
I gotta be honest, that's too Gen Z for...
What? How? You've never heard of Fifth Harmony?
I know
You've never
Fifth
heard-
Harmony. Maybe it's just not my.
It's not your forte. I'll give you a One Direction reference instead.
That's probably a bit better.
A bit in your age
Maybe
range.
maybe In Sync.
In Sync? Who's that?
Oh my god.
I love rage baiting you.
Okay. So last week she told the Beyond the Ballot podcast that she is going to be focusing on her consulting business, which is what everyone seems to do after they leave their role. If I ever get fired from Canadaland, I'm going to say that I will be focusing on my consulting business. So if anyone out there needs PowerPoints made, I'm your guy.
Okay, Mr. Suit and Tie.
But this is big because she has been Poilievre's top advisor since he started running. On the podcast, she showed some regret for how the campaign was run. Like, obviously, one of the things she talked about was not focusing enough on the Carleton riding, where he ended up losing to Bruce Fanjoy. But she defended a lot of her decisions, like not focusing on Trump so much in the campaign messaging and instead deciding to focus on cost of living. But something that really stood out to me is she defended the choice the Conservative Party made to get rid of the campaign bus that was reserved for the press. And for the listeners that aren't familiar, during campaigns, Canadian newsrooms usually send a reporter or two on the road with the campaigns to see how things are going on the ground. And the Conservatives broke that tradition last election and didn't allow any reporters inside access. And in the interview, Jenny Byrne defended that decision, and she actually said something that really stood out to me as worrying.
Privately, most of the executives that we spoke to leading into this decision, although they might not have said so to their reporters to save face, they were quite happy with the decision because there's not as much money in media today as what there was 10 years ago, and definitely not what there was 20 years ago.
So do you stand by that decision today?
Yes. I predict that most campaigns will go that way in the next one.
So that little bit there got kind of lost in the news of her stepping down. But if she's telling the truth, that executives in Canadian newsrooms were excited about the fact that parties didn't want journalists along for the campaigns just to save money, that is bleak, because that is a huge part of the election process, having reporters tag along with the campaigns. So
What'd you say about her ex-man, possibly future PM, Pierre Poilievre?
for future PMPP.
Yeah, PMPP. I like that.
Well, in true Jenny Byrne fashion, she attacked Carney first off.
Carney is kind of ragging the puck or kicking the can down the road, however you want to say it. And I would just say to Conservatives, it's summer. Get through the summer. Pierre's going to be back in the House on, whatever day, September 17th or whatever day. The real kind of next chapter starts on, I think it's Tuesday, September 2nd.
And then she reaffirmed that Poilievre is still destined to be the prime minister.
I feel like if I don't get to do this, I feel like that's it. Like I might die.
Aw, poor Kendall Roy. What else you got?
Well, there was some military news this week. Do you think Carney heard our last episode, Full Mental Jacket?
He may have.
Yeah, well, in an effort to provide some support for the lowest ranking military positions, the government announced a $2 billion per year series of salary top-ups and incentives on Friday, and the changes will affect the lowest ranks of the regular forces, like privates, ordinary sailors, aviators, and they will be receiving a 20% pay increase. And from what I've seen, this is a long time coming. Very, very low-level people in the military are barely making a living wage. So a good change, and maybe in the future, if our military men are getting paid a bit more, they can worry less about starting race wars and overthrowing the government.
It's not that I'm necessarily opposed to pay increases. I have no stake in the pay increases for the military, but it's interesting to me that in the midst of all the news that's coming out about what's going on inside of our military, there needs to be some sort of deeper investment to address like long-standing issues with the military. I think they've had issues with extremism, but recruitment, and maybe that helps with the recruitment problem, like getting people to join because they're being paid more.
I am firmly of the opinion that when people get paid well, they do their job better.
Sam, thanks for the updates. I'll see you next week.
I will see you next week.
If you like this episode, leave us a like, a comment, a subscribe, hit the bell button. If this episode pissed you off, I'd encourage you to do the same. Leave us a like, leave us a comment, tell us what pissed you off, or you can email me at noor@canadaland.com to tell me what pissed you off. And you can also tell me what you wish we would talk about on this show. You can also support us at canadaland.com/join. It would be lovely if you became a supporter and made the wheels on the bus go round and round for us. Anyway, we'll see you next week.